We're closing in on a month since the release of Dragon Ball Fusion World, and with that in mind, I think we can finally start talking about what the meta looks like. Everybody, Espira, and we're jumping into a meta tier list, and I'm so excited to finally be able to dig into this now that we have tournament data, play data. We've been able to mess with the cards for about 3 to 4 weeks, and while I do think some of the data we're receiving is skewed because of the way that the ladder works on the digital version and the way that matchmaking isn't really skill-based and all that stuff, I do think that we've seen enough with the game and experimented enough with the game to finally get a good grasp of where everything lines up. So unlike my leader tier list that I made before the set came out, where it was a little bit more speculative and a little bit more tied into what the leader potentials are, now I think we can talk about what the meta is truly looking like. In terms of the tiering, Z tier is the meta defining tier, the ones that are likely to win tournaments and the ones that you need to play around to do well in this meta. When we're talking about A tiers, we're talking about contenders, the ones that can match up and aren't always likely to win, may have some varied matchup here and there, but have solid ways to be able to combat either themselves or as well Z tier decks. When we're looking at B, we're looking at decks that may struggle in some region or another. They can potentially get there, they have strengths, but for one reason or another, whether that be a lack on the defensive side, or whether that be because the card pool isn't really lining up perfectly what it wants to do, it can struggle, and as such, leans itself to needing to work a little bit harder to do well. When it comes to C tier, these are decks that may find themselves in a certain niche, or may have a position where they're able to go in and put in some work, but overall have some big flaws or lacks in capability to really have a consistent showing. You could potentially put this as Rogue, and I think that would be also fine. Although I do think Rogue more lines up specifically with decks that can take advantage of certain metas, whereas at the moment, I don't know that that really exists currently in the game. And then finally, F are strategies that are not worth playing whatsoever, that you shouldn't really consider unless you're just out to have fun, because they just have major flaws that prevent them from really being a contender. To kick it off, we'll look at the starter decks and then make our way down through the main set from there. So first off, Starter-Ku. I love Starter-Ku. I think he has a great balance of defensive and offensive tools, lends itself as the red deck that can apply a ton of pressure, but also that can maintain control of the board as well. So it sits in that middle, perfect mid-range deck for red. While it's not defining anything, I think it's incredibly strong. I think it has a great set of tools. And I do like that you're allowed to pivot, which means that you have a greater spread of matchups. So in that regard, I think it's a fantastic A tier. Does not define the meta by any way, shape, or form, but is a solid contender that can play in just about any matchup. I don't think there's any matchup you face where if you're playing as Starter-Ku, you feel like you can't take the game. Moving on from Goku, when we're looking at Blue Vegeta, it's a little bit tough to evaluate Blue Vegeta specifically because of where Blue is at the moment. It feels as a whole, Blue does some really powerful things. I do not want to deny the power of being able to peel off loop, of being able to recur hand advantage as easily as Blue does, and especially when we're looking at Vegeta, who's a 35k attacker. Unfortunately, I think you need to work a little too hard to make the 7-hand or less requirement work for a lot of the cards, and I think, you know, if you're playing really aggro as Vegeta, you have too many cards in hand, so you combo inefficiently. But if you're not playing aggro, you're not really getting the most benefit of being able to be a 35k. And then I know some people come up with the idea that like, hey, you should only ever look at those abilities as extra perks. But I don't know that the baseline of the cards that you use needing those requirements of 7 or less are good enough to justify sometimes getting a bonus on their abilities. I do think Blue decks can get there. I just think they need to work harder and don't inherently have that card quality that allows it to have to just do its own thing without being considerate of what everyone else is doing. Because of that, I'm leaning towards putting Vegeta in B tier. I think it's okay. I don't think it's bad. I think you can do well with it, but you are going to have to work harder. And then as a player, and especially if you're a good player looking to compete, you have to justify to yourself, why am I working harder? Is that for a better matchup spread? Is that because there are tools in this color that allow me to deal with what we're currently seeing in the meta that other colors can't provide me? And while I don't doubt that some of that does exist in Blue, I don't see it in enough depth to really, for me, justify the push. It's not terrible. Again, B tier are solid decks that can probably lock themselves atop, maybe even a win depending on the tournament and how they're able to run. But I do think you need to work that much harder. And at the end of the day, there's only so much compensation you can do for pure card quality, which kind of goes to green strengths when we're going to talk about it in just a moment. Then we've got Frieza, and Frieza is an excellent, excellent leader with an excellent set of cards. Hand advantage, aggression, board control, and Frieza is the best leader to utilize all of that. Not only are you maximizing on your ability to be able to control your opponent's board, but you are constantly getting a return on your investment with combo power, getting to get additional blockers, and the fact that you're not committing those blockers just for the sake of being blockers, but like between Kui, between 2-drop Zarbon, between Cooler, the fact that they're good beat sticks that double up as blockers is what makes them incredibly well. So you have so much utility, and you can be aggressive, you can be board control, and Frieza is the best at pivoting between all of those playstyles because of how well it manages advantage. And because of that, and because of the way that it can pivot its game plan, it is the first Z tier deck. I think it's incredibly powerful, and you can play any playstyle with the strategy. And not only that, but while this is specific to this meta, I think it is a leader that represents itself incredibly strong moving into the future. It is really hard to justify any scenario where Frieza will be bad and not really viable. So a lot of longevity with this leader, and I expect to do really good things, especially considering that it can have a positive green matchup while still being cognizant of the other matchups in the meta. That said, a lot of what yellow does is dictated specifically because of the power and card quality of green. And because of that, and because Broly is so incredibly strong at what it does, it is our second and top of Z tier leader. Green has so much quality in its card pool in terms of being able to board wipe, recur health, apply pressure, clean up board control if you get into the mid game. And that all of that card quality is maximized when you use leader abilities that make it harder for your opponent to get to you, especially since their strategies against you are going to be trying to press you early and trying to aggress you down. And it's specifically because of that strategy that decks need to onboard that it makes Broly so strong. And something that we're going to see when we talk about other green decks like the androids and Gohan in a bit. Having that 25k base on Awaken means that your opponent can't just swing 20ks at you. They're going to have to dwindle down their hand to even just attempt to deal damage to you, which means that you are winning in that hand advantage game, especially as you just need to delay until you either board wipe them with the secret rare or clean up the board with the androids or close out the game with Broly. Your inevitability tied in with the fact that your leader ability gives you that longevity is absolutely massive and a huge component of why Broly probably deals with the entirety of the meta the best while being super selfish in its game plan and doing just what it wants to do. You guys know I'm a Gohan stan, but going blind, if I had to pick a green deck and I wasn't entirely sure what everyone was going to play, Broly just encaptures it all in terms of having the tools needed to more consistently get to the late game, whether you're dealing with a mid-range deck, a slow deck, or a fast aggro deck. With the starter decks aside, we now move into the main set, kicking it off with Red U7. And when it comes to Red U7, it does very similar things to what the starter coup deck is doing, but more aggressive. You have a harder time pivoting into a more defensive type play. You do get some board control because your red cards just naturally do that. But for the most part, you are pressuring your opponents. And right now, with the way that green is positioned, it does that incredibly well. Whether you're going up against Gohan's and able to throw, just a bunch of 20Ks at the deck, versus whether you're going up against Broly and now you're 25Ks or 30Ks and you're 35Ks or 40Ks. And so your big beat sticks line up even better as well. I think specifically because right now being an aggressive based strategy benefits you versus what green is posing as a threat in the current meta. I think Red U7 is poised to be a fantastic A tier deck. I do think if the meta was a little bit slower, and it's weird to talk about slower because we're talking about, the top strategy being a RAM strategy, which needs to take a lot of time, but it needs to take a lot of time while still being inevitable. What green is trying to do puts a hard clock on how long the game is allowed to take. If the game were allowed to take longer, then I think we'd be in a position where people could focus more on board control components of their decks, and Red U7 wouldn't do as well. So I do think in a world in which things are a little bit slowed down, you would be able to have more tools to deal with the aggression of Red U7, and U7 Goku would bump down. But currently, I think the numbers line up really well. You can get some really great bodies on board for cheap. And if you're going heavy, then your heavy top ends line up with really good numbers like 35K for the double strike. And then it's, just a 40K with the Red U7 leader. You dump a 5K into that. It's now 45. Your Broly opponent needs to dump a super combo. So in that regard, I think both of these red strategies do really well. I prefer Starter Coup because it has a better spread across the entirety of the meta. But when we're talking about having to deal with yellow, which red just inherently has a pretty good matchup with anyways, as well as being and having the aggression of green, I think they do well. The big reason why they're not in Z tier is because they're not really defining the meta. Both of these decks need to be warped and warp around having to deal with both of these decks as opposed to being the reason that the meta shapes around it. With that idea in mind, I think we push Beerus to B tier. Biggest reason for that Beerus kind of strays away from both of these leaders is the fact that it is the more slower control your deck. Of course, you could play a bit more of like a crit design build, and that probably would do better in the meta. But nevertheless, the advantages you're getting from the other red leaders are missed on Beerus, and his board control deals best with mid-range. And unfortunately, we're not in a mid-range format as much as we're in a big top-end format that just needs to account for being aggro when you need to. And because you're a crit side leader, you're not digging as many cards into your deck as you need to. So you can't make the options that allow you to pivot from one game plan to another as easily. And because of that, I think the deck's matchups are swingier. I think you can still do well against yellow. I think you can, well, to be fair, I think you can do well against any of these decks. I've definitely been pressured and put in some tight spots against Beer's decks. But for the most part, I think were I facing a starter coup or U7 deck, oftentimes in those positions, they would have done just as well, if not better, than what Beerus was presenting. At the moment, board controlling in a meta where green is your biggest threat doesn't seem like the best. And even when we're considering yellow, red doesn't necessarily need the help of Beerus to be able to board control yellow while applying pressure. The big benefit, though, being that Beerus is incredibly generic, and with set 2 and onwards, there are always options that could allow to feed into the red control that will potentially make it better, especially as we might stray away in the future from it just being kind of like a play a drop Broly type format. Goku Black. I think Goku Black sits in B tier, higher off than Vegeta in my personal opinion, but nevertheless still in B tier, where it just has some weaknesses where you're very scripted in what you want to do. Oftentimes you can't afford to be greedy with trying to set up a Zamasu play a turn early, because if your opponent knows what's going on, they're just going to get rid of the Zamasu. That doesn't really matter. And your deck falls apart if you're not able to find your Goku Blacks. Yeah, you could do some of the peel off recursion stuff to apply pressure, but nevertheless, I think Goku Black is just one of those decks where it tries to optimize for one very specific thing to happen. And if that specific thing doesn't happen, it struggles, especially when you account for the fact that you need to run a bunch of dig in your deck because your leader on the front side doesn't draw. And because your leader doesn't draw, you're not finding the pieces you need to fast enough. So you need to compensate for that. And sometimes that compensation doesn't really get there. You need quite a few things to go right in a match for Goku Black to play the way that it specifically wants to. And I don't know that that necessarily lines up the best when we're talking about the way that yellow can board control the game, as well as the fact that green has the inevitability that the deck kind of has a tough time with. There's not much that Goku Black can do against Broly. And if you're not finding your pieces quick enough to be able to get there, dealing with an 8-drop Broly is effectively the best way to deal with a Goku Black as well. So it has the best tools to deal with it, as well as apply pressure to you to close out the game. And then when you tie in the fact that Goku Black and auto resolution timings are currently bugged in the client and they don't work the way that they're meant to, then the deck is not a ton, but is definitely worse. The way things currently work, if you attack with 6-drop Goku Black and you play, say, 3-drop Trunks that can bounce anything off the board, 5 or less, your opponent with a cooler, if you're playing against yellow, can still block the Goku Black and rest mode the Trunks before they have the chance to bounce your cooler. And that's not the way it's meant to work, but that's the way it's currently coded in the client. So not only do I think, and regardless of all that, I think Goku Black is still B tier. But on top of that, if you're playing online, it has that additional bug onto it, which does not help, especially when yellow can be so prominent in the meta. Shifting over to Trunks, and Trunks is actually going to be the first deck that cracks into C tier. I put Trunks, and I almost agree with a lot of people in where they say Trunks is the big brain deck. You know, like anyone can win with Trunks if they're big brain enough. And I get it, right? If you can sequence your plays perfectly, you can manage your resources, you can loop perfectly. He's got tempo removal. I do think Trunks can be in a position to win a lot of matchups. The problem that is just you need to put so much work, so much time. And I'm not totally sold that all that work and effort you're going to do is going to outdo the card quality of players who are just using better cards that take less effort from you, right? Oftentimes blue feels like you're doing like a kick flip into a back flip into, just a bunch of different tricks to kind of do the same things or very similar things that a lot of the other colors are doing. Sometimes that does lend itself to be in a position where with 2 cards, you're able to attack for like 70 or 80K. Sometimes that does happen, but oftentimes it just feels like you're spending a lot of time recurring the same advantage that you needed to not lose, but not necessarily allow you to win. I like Trunks a lot. I think it could be in a position to do well. I just think at the moment, blue and specifically Trunks is in a position where they just need more cards that don't necessarily care about you being at 7 hand or less to fully utilize the way that this deck plays mid-range. It plays more control, it plays more lean in tempo without having to just inefficiently combo to account for the fact that you want to maximize the value of your deck. But there are incredibly powerful plays of playing 2 or 3 Mai's, bouncing your opponent's cards, drawing 3 or 4 cards, depending on the situation. So it can lend itself to great plays. I'm just a little bit suspect of the fact that you need to work so hard to make that work. I think it's fun. I still believe in Trunks. I just don't necessarily know where its place is in the meta. And, like it or not, metas are also defined by a numbers thing. And the number of Trunks we see are incredibly low. Even just in Eggman's tournament this past weekend, there was 1. So it might be better, but I don't think it makes sense to talk about it in a meta tier list and say like, well, if you're the right like Giga Brain player, he's actually Z tier when you're only ever going to play 0 in a tournament. Seeing a deck is part of understanding the meta. And because we're not seeing Trunks, as well as because he's so hard to pilot, to get him to a competent level, and at that point, I'm not even sold if that's better than running Frieza or Broly or some of the red decks. I think at the moment, he's just solidified himself as a C tier leader. Shifting over to green, and I think this is where the conversation piece really pivots away. Going into my leader tier list, green was effectively its own tiering. It was at the top, and I do still think a lot of the meta is defined by what green does. The amount of Gohans, the amount of Brolys you see can't help but force people to have to build their decks in a certain way. In that way, though, not all green leaders are built equally. When it comes to androids, I think they're B tier. I think they're top of B tier because you can do green selfish things, but the thing with androids is that I don't think androids inherently do anything better than Gohan or Broly do. A lot of decks are going to want to rush you down, and you don't have the defensive properties of being a 25k base or having an ability that turns you into a 35k. While you do get your 10k buff for free on aggression, and it allows you to play a bit more of a mid-rangey green deck, you're not being as unfair as the other strategies. Sure, Dr. Joe's lab exists, and it allows you to be more consistent with your ramp, but even then, with Dr. Joe's lab, the dead turn you take for lab doesn't even give you the free energy for the turn afterwards. Whereas if you're using Say and ramp stuff and you're using Destructive Strength, yeah, it's a dead turn, but you immediately get the usage of the energy going into the next turn. So if you're the first turn player, you go from 3 to 5. Whereas if you're androids, you're going from 3 to 4, getting a replacement on that 4, going to 5, but you don't get to use the 5th on that turn. So you're not as fast. And I think speed of inevitability is the greatest power that green has. So in that regard, I think it's not far off. I think you could put Android 17 here and you'd be fine, right? Like you could just play the same package in there. But I do think that because it doesn't have any innate defensive tools, I think it lends itself more so to being here. And it's probably one of the reasons why you see it less. And again, numbers matter when we're talking about meta, like it or not. We don't see a bunch of androids. You see many more Gohans, many more Brolys. And I think that sticks androids down here. We see lots of Gohans, so much Gohans, but Gohan has innate weaknesses. Gohan does not deal with go wide aggro the same way that Broly does. And it actually can be quite weak to it. I fear facing against Friezas that are running the Ginyu package or U7s that are able to awaken early. Everything about those strategies really prey on the fact that Gohan doesn't want to take multiple hits. If your opponent decides to go tall and swing with 30Ks and 40Ks on one boss monster, then yes, Gohan feels incredibly powerful at that point, especially when you have Selku set up. But because oftentimes you're going to work around making sure that that doesn't happen, and a lot of really experienced players are just going to go wide instead, at that point, your plays as Gohan are always very scripted. Your opponent knows what you're trying to do, and you know what you're trying to do. And the only thing that you have to skill gap your opponent is your card quality. And that's not even skill gapping, right? Like you just have to pray that you see the right cards to defend early to be able to secret rare their board and then hopefully be able to close out or play Android 17 and 18. So because of that, you're not really given a ton of opportunity as the green player playing Gohan to really make an innate difference on the outcome of the game, at least when it comes to the early stuff. Versus Broly does have that 25k base on all the time without needing a Selku on board, which forces your opponent to have to combo more, which means that you have a lot more opportunities to be able to force your opponent to be in a disadvantageous position in how they're attacking. Whereas with Gohan, it's just a position of how many 20Ks can I take. But Gohan has a good mirror matchup, right? Being a 35k attacker into Broly is super, super solid. And oftentimes the mirror comes down to who can apply more big pressure on each leader on multiple swings. And the fact that your leader does that does put Gohan in a pretty good spot. So it's top of A. It is almost Z tier, but unfortunately handles wide a lot worse. So it does have that innate weakness that it can't really build around too well. There's not too many tools in green that exist for a base 20k leader to be able to deal with a bunch of 20k swings coming at you. And because of that, while he's incredibly powerful, I love Gohan. I think he's a fantastic leader and can do incredibly well. Does pin it as top of A tier, but unfortunately will never be in a position to be Z tier at the moment because the tools don't exist to deal with wide aggro. And it allows a lot of other decks to have a lot of opportunity to be able to deal damage and close out the game versus this leader. Finally, we're shifting over to yellow, and yellow actually contains the one crit leader that I consider A tier. I think Cooler is an incredibly solid leader in terms of applying pressure, especially with the way that it lines up against green. Against Gohan, you can still do the go wide while having multiple attacks with those boss monsters, which for the most part, Gohan, it's the go wide that's the issue. Although, however, against Broly, being able to attack twice with the 40k Frieza, twice with the 30k Cooler, and then having the backup of the double strikers to be able to close out the game is incredibly powerful. This deck has a phenomenal matchup versus green, and it lines up incredibly well versus Broly as well, because you can get multiple uses out of your boss monsters. So much so that you could argue Cooler is better than Frieza at dealing with green, just because of the way that it aggresses. Alternatively though, Cooler cannot pivot to board control as well. It cannot pivot its game plan. It is so locked into being the aggressive deck. And because of that, it sacrifices his matchup elsewhere. Cooler is ostensibly worse versus Frieza, depending. It has some cute uses because of the way that your restand works, but nevertheless, Frieza will often have the advantage. Against the red decks, it's much worse. And it can sometimes struggle with the blue decks, to be totally honest, because you're not going to out advantage them drawing a bunch of cards to defend against your aggro, which to aggro with Cooler, you need to pitch even more cards. So you're just low on cards often, so it lends itself to having to be that aggro deck because of how well it lines up with the green decks, and because it can apply really, really strong pressure. It can play the Ginyu package, which is really solid, which means that you can still have game against the yellow decks. You can still have game against the blue decks. I think it's incredibly solid. I think it's just barely eking out to A tier, but because of how solid it is into green, and it can still do a fine aggro thing against all the other decks, I think it's solidly in A tier. And then there's Ginyu. Ginyu is suspect for me because like I really want to put Ginyu here. I really, really want to put Ginyu in F tier. The big reason I'm not, and actually going to shift him over to C tier, is because Ginyu has the swingiest matchups in the game. I legitimately think Ginyu into Gohan is like 90-10 for Ginyu. It is an incredibly heartbreaking matchup that Gohan has no tools for. You either are able to stabilize because you got lucky or your opponent misplayed or something, or this guy's just killing you. The problem is that his matchups are really swingy and can be really, really, really bad, right? If you go up against red, it's a hard matchup. Not only is it a hard matchup, but they have Frost. And if you're dealing with Frost, you're probably losing. So it's just one of those things where like, the card recursion from blue means that your 20k pokes aren't often going to get there because they're just going to constantly peel off loop over and over and over again so that you just run out of gas and then they're able to take you out, right? It's one of those things where the matchups either go really hard in Ginyu's favor or really bad. And Ginyu is one of those decks where if it sees the wrong matchups, it loses every single one. If it sees the right matchups, it wins every single one. So if there ever was a rogue deck, Ginyu would be in that rogue category where like, you know what, if you could make the meta call that every single deck you're going to see in a tournament is going to be some variation of playing against like green and like these guys, then I think you're in a position where, you know what, it's the right meta call. But outside of that, it is so easily countered because you just have to account for getting more advantage, getting more cards, maintaining the board, controlling the board. And almost every single deck has ways to be able to do that if they're preparing for it. And because of that, it's just like, oh my God, but it can win. And to be honest, like it can win against Broly. It can sometimes win against Frieza, although it's not easy. It can win against Cooler. So it's not like the deck can't win. It's just the matchups are so swingy. And if your opponent sees you coming, they can prepare for you in a way that really doesn't let you play the game. So because of that, like I really want to see like Rogue. And the thing with Rogue is that like a lot of people see Rogue and they're like, oh, okay. So it's like Rogue is below B tier decks. And it's like, it's not even like a spectrum in my opinion. When you're talking about Rogue decks, they don't live on the scale. So if your scale is from like, S tier, Z tier, whatever you want to call it, to F tier, Rogue almost lives in its own separate spectrum in terms of if you find the right opportunity in the meta to be able to take advantage of certain ways people are playing their decks, building their decks, playing the game, then you might have success for a tournament, 2 tournaments. But once people are wise about what you're doing, it can easily be answered and then throw you back to the bottom of the meta because you can't really do anything. That's what I see with Ginyu, and to some extent what I see with Trunks. The fact that you can find some inches in the meta depending on how people play it, you might find a tournament to take advantage of that and get a big win. But once people are privy of what you're up to, the jig is up. That's about as far as you're getting. So whether we want to call it C tier, whether we want to call this Rogue, I'm not entirely sure. But I do think it kind of fits in the category where like these leaders can find success, but it's under very specific conditions at the moment. And if the timing is right. With all those leaders placed, you'll actually notice that there's none in the F tier. And that's because I think at the moment we're in a pretty balanced part of it, not super balanced, right? I think green's inevitability forces the meta in a way that I don't totally love. But nevertheless, I think every leader has the capacity of topping and doing well at a tournament. I don't know about winning, right? Like I am suspect about like a Trunks deck winning or potentially even like an Androids deck winning or something like that, or Beerus, but it is possible, unlikely, but still possible. And all of them can contend. You top with any of these decks And besides these two, which is a little suspect, I think most decks have the potential to get there. And even then, if the 1 or 2 of Ginyu or the 1 or 2 of Trunks gets there, I would not be all that surprised. We're currently in a place in Dragon Ball Fusion World where you could take any color and have a good solid amount of success. I think blue needs to work harder than other decks at the moment to be able to get there, but with enough time and grinding and understanding the meta and your deck, I think you can definitely get there. And as far as every other color, you always have an option in either Z tier or A tier, which is great. I think being able to explore all the colors on an almost even basis feels really good. Unfortunately, I do feel the over centralization of green forces the meta to be a certain specific way in the way that people are building their decks and playing. But nevertheless, the fact that it's still a game and we don't have a tier 0 format where there's just nothing you can do, sometimes the inevitability gets there, I'm not saying it doesn't, I think is really good, really exciting, and has me jazzed to see how the deepening of the card pool with set 2 will shake things up. That said though, I could be totally wrong, and you know what? You guys are really good at trying to tell me when I'm wrong, whether you yourselves are correct or not. So let me know down there what you guys think of the meta and whether you would swap things out here and there, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.